But right now, I'd like to welcome my first guest, Paul Bishop. Paul C. Bishop is a senior economist with the National Association of Realtors. He's the vice president of research and leads the research division's market research activities, including analysis of real estate business and policy issues. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
Okay, so first of all, they put Paul C. in the prompter. So I always need to know, when they put a middle initial in there, did that come from you, or is that just the people in our back room being extra anal retentive?
No, that one comes from me. That's how I usually identify myself.
Okay, sounds good. What does the C stand for, by the way? I need to know.
Charles.
Charles, okay. So Paul, first let's talk about the real estate market in general. What do you see happening over the last several months, the early parts of 2018, and what does it mean?
Okay, the real estate market for home buyers and sellers is really pretty challenging right now. One of the defining characteristics of the market right now, from the perspective of home buyers, is there just aren't nearly enough homes on the market to purchase. So we have, a very low level of inventory, something that we haven't seen in a very long time. Just to give you an example, what we consider a balanced market of homes on the market would be about a 6-month supply. And right now we're about half that, about a 3-month supply. Mm-hmm. So that alone suggests there's very few homes available for sale on the market. Mm-hmm. And
most that has to do with what happened during the financial crisis, where people weren't building spec homes anymore, so the supply didn't grow at the same pace as it had historically, correct?
That's correct. If you look back over the last several years, home builders were not able to build nearly as many homes as needed, and so they're just now trying to catch up after years of really subpar building levels. And one of the results of that is there's too few homes available for sale on the market mm-hmm. at virtually all price points, and so it's putting a lot of stress in different areas of the market. And most buyers in just about every part of the country are seeing and feeling that.
So the demand is continuing to go up, which is good. But mortgage rates are also going up. So which one is winning out so far in 2018?
Well, we've seen over the past several years home prices increase at roughly a 6% annual mm-hmm. rate. And so that has put a lot of stress on affordability, and it has now for the last several years as we've come out of the financial crisis. But what we've seen, especially over the last few weeks, is that mortgage rates have really ticked up. And at the start of the year, they were roughly 4% for a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, and right now we're looking at 30-year fixed rate of 4.5%. So that's a pretty significant jump over a short period of time. So that's also one of the factors that's adding to an affordability squeeze that buyers, and especially first-time buyers, are feeling when they're looking to purchase their first home.
Are the banks loosening up credit lines for builders again? Is that starting to get easier for them?
Yeah, from the perspective of builders, credit is much more available than it was several years ago coming out of the financial crisis. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of other headwinds builders are facing, and one of the most frequent ones that we hear about is the fact that there is just a lack of skilled labor in the building trades. So builders are really limited in terms of how fast they can build homes, simply because they don't have the skilled labor necessary in terms of carpenters, masons, and so forth to build homes. So that's one factor that's holding back builders. Mm-hmm. And, in addition to the fact that just the process of getting zoning approvals and so forth always has taken a long time, but, there's evidence that it's actually taking longer and is more costly than it has been in the past as well.
Now, my concern is always that things lag. So when things start heating up again, builders typically overbuild because they keep going. The banks are willing to overlend. And then ultimately there's another, I don't want to use the word crash, because what happened in 2018 was more significant than we've seen in a long time, but you see another major real estate downturn. Do you think that cycle is going to continue to repeat itself, or do you think maybe with these other factors you mentioned that it might slow down the builders just enough so maybe the demand or the supply doesn't overshoot demand?
At this point, I don't think we're in much danger of overbuilding. And the reason I say that is we've had several years coming out of the financial crisis of pent-up demand. For example, we can see that with millennial home buyers. We recently released a report where we showed that about a third of all home sales are going to millennials at this point. And that's only a small segment of the millennials that are out there, not yet in the housing market, who, by all indications and the data we've collected, want to be a homeowner at some point in the future, but just haven't been able to make that transition yet. So unlike what we've seen in maybe previous cycles that with the bubble and so forth, the demand really seems to be there, not just from the traditional segments of move-up buyers, but also from first-time buyers who are anxious to get into the market as well.
You know, Paul, it's interesting. We need to take a quick commercial break. We come back. I want to talk to you about those first-time home buyers and millennials and their appetite for real estate. So stay with us. We'll be right back with a lot more here from my good friend Paul Charles on the income generation. We'll be right back. Right now it's time to welcome back Paul Charles Bishop. So the millennials, you know, people say that millennials don't have that 1950s type American dream that everyone needs to buy a home, and you know, there's concern that the demand won't be growing at the pace adequate enough to maybe replace the fact that baby boomers to some extent are downsizing. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, we've certainly seen a lot of headlines in the press suggesting that the millennial generation has a different view of home ownership, that they're just not as enthralled with home ownership as, say, the baby boomers have been. But I think, you know, there's a way to look at this that maybe brings the current housing market into focus a little bit better. One of the things that we have done over the last several years, and other organizations have done it as well, is we survey millennials on a regular basis. And among the things we ask them is their views about home ownership and whether buying a home is a good financial decision. Most recently, when we asked millennial renters, so those who have not yet purchased their first home, if they would like to be a homeowner at some point in the future, 90% of those millennial renters said, yes, I'd like to be a homeowner in the future, even if I can't yet do it today. So there seems to be a lot of desire to be a homeowner, but at the same time, there's a number of hurdles in terms of accumulating a down payment, keeping up with rent payments that they're currently paying, as well as just finding the right home for them that are limiting their ability to purchase that first home.
So maybe it's just as simple as millennials are getting married a little later in life and they're buying homes later in life. So hopefully that demand will stay at the levels that you're describing. But you know, how about the concern about baby boomers, about our generation starting to downsize? You know, I know there's some wealthy individuals who are saying, fine, I want to buy a second home, a vacation property, maybe a place in a warmer climate or a ski resort, but at the end of the day, most average folks, if anything, have bought their dream homes. They might be downsizing, money coming out of the real estate market. How do you think that demographic will affect real estate prices in the years to come?
Well, what we've started to see over the last few years is that most homeowners are staying in their home for a longer period of time, and certainly that would include the baby boomers. Now, at some point, of course, most older baby boomers and the generations that follow will probably downsize and move to a desirable location to retire. But at this point, it doesn't seem like there's much urgency on baby boomers' part to make that transition. In fact, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of analysis done on this concept of aging in place. So how can baby boomers make their home more accessible even as they do get older? Because a number of baby boomers who have bought that dream home are maybe reluctant to trade it in for a much smaller home or move out of a community where they've built a lot of social connections. So I don't have no doubt that at some point most baby boomers will make that transition, but at this point I think there's some evidence to suggest that they're actually pushing that decision further down the line than maybe previous generations have.
Okay. Of course, who knows, with the new Trump tax plan, you never know. Some of the higher tax states, such as Connecticut, where I'm from, they could actually do the opposite. It could probably push people out the door sooner just because, in fact, I was talking to somebody just today, a client of mine in Connecticut, who with the taxes, he was actually thinking, I was going to retire here, now I may not. So we'll see what effect that has. But tell us, with maybe the millennials not having quite the appetite to buy homes right now, with it being harder and harder to come up with the down payment, maybe mortgages being more restrictive than they were a decade ago. Is there great opportunity today in home rental properties as an investment?
What we've seen now over the last several years is the number of renter households has continued to grow. Part of that is a result of the millennials not being able to make that transition into home ownership, but There's also a lot of demand for rental properties and being a renter household among older generations as well. So from an investor standpoint, what we've seen is a lot of investment activity over the last several years, especially coming out of the financial
Mhm.
crisis. And by our estimate, about 20% of the residential property that's sold each year is sold to investors. So it's
Interesting.
getting more and more difficult to find the properties that make sense from an investor standpoint. But I think that the
But
demand
they could be a good
will be there for
opportunity.
quite
Yeah.
some time.
Well, I hear the music in the background when you take another commercial break. Paul, don't go away. We'll be back with more, and we'll talk more with Paul Bishop about other types of investment properties. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Now it's time once again to welcome back Paul Charles Bishop. Paul, sorry to cut you off there before the break, but our producer, you see, she's a 4th-degree black belt in martial arts. So when I hear the music, I know enough that I need to just stop talking, go right to commercial. So rental properties, you're saying, for residential at least, are getting harder to get good deals on them from a buyer's standpoint. But if you can get the right deal, you think the demand's going to be here for a long time to make it a reasonable investment. Is that your summation for the most
That's
part?
right. There's a lot of renter households out there, and so the demand for rental properties is probably going to be strong for at least the short term, the foreseeable future, the next few years.
So let's talk about other types of investment property then. We have office, we have retail, industrial, even healthcare, although most people don't invest in healthcare individually, but through a real estate investment trust they may. How do you feel some of those sectors are going to be? Which ones are going to be stronger? Which ones are going to be weaker, and why?
Well, I think looking over the near term, like I said, over the next year or so, some of the stronger commercial property sectors are going to be in the industrial and distribution area. All of the online shopping that takes place these days requires a lot of industrial distribution space, and most online retailers are trying to get closer and closer to the consumer. So there's going to be, I think, some investment opportunities in the industrial sector. The multifamily sector, think apartments, as we talked about earlier, the demand for rental properties is going to continue to be fairly strong. We have, the millennials who are just making their presence known in the housing market at this point, and then generations to follow, which is also another large generation. So the outlook for multifamily is probably fairly strong as well. Maybe not as strong as it was a couple of years ago, since builders have been able to catch up with demand in the multifamily sector.
Okay.
And look to the office sector. Really, that's about what we see in terms of the job sector overall. We've seen fairly strong job growth over the last couple months and consistent job growth over the last several years. So there's continuing opportunities in the office sector, but a lot of that is really regional and probably very much dependent on the particular market that you're looking in. Mid-sized cities versus large cities.
How about smaller offices?
Dynamics.
How about smaller offices for the people that are not in that 4.1% unemployment rate anymore, the people who are maybe discouraged workers that have stopped looking, that have taken up a consulting position? How about some of those?
Well, there's certainly a lot of businesses out there that are trying to cater to that segment of the population looking for that short-term office rental space. So I think that's going to evolve over time as we see more of the baby boomers perhaps moving toward kind of a consulting or more freelance type work. So I think there's some opportunities there as well.
Okay. And I cut you off. I know you're working into retail. So if industrial is, you think, could be hot coming up in the future because a lot of the online purchases and the storage and shipping and so on, then does that mean retail, for lack of a better way to put it, is kind of sort of the redheaded stepchild?
Well, retail is certainly going through a transition. There are any number of store closings we've heard about over the last few years as retailers struggle to make that transition, given that a lot of people are doing their shopping online. And we know there are a lot of malls, many of which were built in the 1980s, that are trying to repurpose themselves into areas, into types of experience-based malls that don't just cater to people going there on a Saturday afternoon to do their shopping. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the retail sector, and I think probably overall the retail sector is largely overbuilt at this point. So until the retail sector really finds its footing again, whatever that might mean in the world of online shopping, where most of us are comfortable buying a lot of things online, I think there's some uncertainty in terms of how the retail sector is going to work out and how it's going to play out over the next probably 2 to 3 years, especially.
Yeah, you see, it's so weird because I know traditionally real estate says, okay, we've got longer term leases here, so it seems to be more stable on the retail side. But I agree with you. Right now, we're in this changing world. So, Paul, thanks so much for your time today. Stay with us. We'll be right back.